Welcome to Evidence Based, a new Harbinger psychology podcast. I'm your host, Cassie Stossel. On today's episode, we're discussing EMDR and trauma. We're joined by Megan Boardman, author of the EMDR workbook for trauma and PTSD. Megan is a licensed clinical social worker who specializes in treating trauma and addiction. She owns and operates her own clinical practice in Idaho and provides supervision and consultation throughout the nation to clinicians and businesses seeking ongoing trauma training and EMDR. She is a member of the EMDR International Association and is currently certified as an EMDR clinician as well as an EMDR consultant in training. Hi, Megan. Thanks so much for joining us on Evidence Based.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I think it's an important topic. And I wanted to get us started with, can you define the difference between trauma and PTSD?
Yeah, and it's funny that this is what we're starting with because I think this is something that people get confused on a lot. So I love that we're opening this way. So for me, I always tell clinicians and clients when I'm working with them on understanding what is trauma and how do I know if my trauma is PTSD. I like to start with the definitions of trauma first, because to me, that helps embody what trauma is. And I think in today's world, we can all identify with some type of trauma. So my own personal definition that I like of trauma is trauma to me can be anything that negatively changes the way in which I see myself, the way I see others, and the way I see the world around me. So anything that negatively impacts my view of self, others, and the world can be traumatic to me, and trauma is different for all of us. The next kind of definitions that I like to use with trauma comes from Bessel van der Kolk's work, where he says trauma is this idea of not being seen or known almost. And I think of that like a loss of connection, where we feel alone in what we're going through or what we're experiencing. And then Gabor Mate recently in his book on the myth of normal talks about trauma being not what happens to us, but what happens inside us, the way that our body changes and our brain changes. And so when we're looking at the difference of trauma and PTSD, to me, PTSD develops when those traumas aren't treated and they go on and you can't quite get over them. So it might be trauma after trauma kind of builds maybe in your system. And PTSD is really this idea of when we have lingering, lasting symptoms of these traumatic events that we face that don't get better with time. That's how I like to kind of differentiate those.
And why are these two things commonly misdiagnosed?
Oh, that's such a loaded question. I think really what happens with the misdiagnosing is really not intentional at all. But the hard thing with trauma and PTSD is that trauma and PTSD mimic so many other disorders, right? So anyone that goes through something traumatic or life-changing, it's natural for us to have symptoms of anxiety around that, of fear, and even depression, like grief, right? That goes with that. And usually when people go into treatment, they're talking about the symptoms that they're having versus what's happened to them to cause those. And so I think that's where a lot of that misdiagnosing comes in.
That makes a lot of sense for people to come in seeking help for those physical sensations, those emotional sensations versus talking about the past. So that makes a lot of sense. What impact does trauma have on the brain as well as the body?
Yeah, the brain and the body are so closely intertwined as we're learning and learning more and more as kind of time goes on right now within the neuroscience of trauma. And trauma really impacts the way that our brain functions. Depending on the age we experience trauma, it even impacts the way the brain develops. And so it can lead to us being more dysregulated. It can lead to us being more reactive. And if we haven't had a lot of periods of safety or even connection, it really does change the way that the brain is able to react and respond and stay regulated. And it impacts the body very similarly. Anytime the brain feels that stress, it starts to send chemicals like adrenaline and other kind of chemicals into our body, cortisol, to prepare us to react and respond. So it increases our heart rate. It can cause problems with gut health. We even know it's related to autoimmune disorders. So the body and the brain are closely intertwined with trauma, but also affect each other quite a bit.
Talk about it being kind of a five senses thing. Can you say a little bit more about that and what that might look like?
Yeah, I love that you're bringing this question up too, because this is one of the places where I feel like we misunderstand trauma sometimes. So, trauma is stored differently than our normal memories and our normal experiences. And a lot of times there's this misconception that with trauma, we should be able to recall it like a narrative or a story. And trauma is not stored that way. So in the book, I talk about this of trauma is stored in our senses. So our brain and our body is less interested in what the story was of whatever the event was taking place. And it's more interested in those survival cues or those things that were interpreted as threats. So it's going to remember the sounds, the smells, the tastes of those events. And those senses get stored as part of that trauma memory versus it being a sequential experience.
Yeah, and that makes sense with the triggers as well. Like you might not know something is a trigger, but one of the senses it comes in. Okay, now I want to ask, what is EMDR and how does it work with PTSD and trauma?
Yeah. So EMDR, it's funny, we don't really even use the full name anymore, right? We use this acronym of EMDR. And so what does EMDR stand for? So EMDR is a mouthful, right? It stands for eye movement, desensitization, reprocessing, and otherwise known as EMDR, the simple way to put it. And really, EMDR is this way to help the brain kind of get all of its systems back online and to help those any of those senses that have been stored that have been associated to the trauma or any of those images or those triggers. It's to kind of help the brain let go of those and stop seeing those as imminent threats or things that are occurring right now. And it's amazing. We know EMDR has been around, since the late 80s and was developed by Francine Shapiro. And it was primarily first developed to treat PTSD in particular. And it is now one of the most researched and evidence-based treatment modalities worldwide for treating PTSD among a variety of other disorders. But it helps with PTSD and helping people be able to get some of those stuck points, those triggers kind of de-escalated so that they can resume functioning a more normal life.
It's funny you said it's hard to say. I was telling my husband about this interview and I was talking about what I learned in your book and I literally could not even. I kept saying it and I was getting tongue-tied trying to say what it actually stands for. Okay, I want to get a little bit into the EMDR. What is a bilateral stimulation technique and can you give an example of some common ones?
Yeah, so EMDR uses this thing we call bilateral stimulation. And that's why in the name itself, we have eye movements. So EMDR was initially, as it came kind of into the forefront and was being developed, a lot of it came from our understanding of what occurs during that REM cycle of sleep, where we have rapid eye movement that go from left to right. And so bilateral stimulation is essentially us stimulating the right and the left side of the brain and the body, or the right and left side of our nervous system. It's getting the nervous system to fully come online, and it's helping your brain start to fire and function together in harmony. Because when trauma occurs, the brain struggles to function all together. There's some parts of the brain that don't work. And so this bilateral stimulation helps the brain work in the way that it's intended to. And so that can be done through eye movements, like in the name, but there's a whole array of different bilateral stimulation techniques. So you can be really creative with this. It's anything that's going to kind of just stimulate the right or the left side. So in the book, we talk about kind of that butterfly hug where you cross your arms and you're tapping, rotating tapping on the right and left side. There's even sound bilateral stimulation. There's all kinds of different forms of modalities that you can do with this, tapping and other things that work really well to kind of help your nervous system get back online.
Does some of that have to do with sort of bringing the focus back to being in the body? Is that like the goal of it?
Yeah, the goal is to kind of help us being really present And anytime trauma occurs, we have this disconnection between our brain and our body. And we also get sent into this back part. There's a disconnection in our brain and the parts. They become like scattered puzzle pieces and they can't function the way they want to. And so that bilateral is kind of helping bring everything back together and connecting it again.
That makes sense. I know I mentioned it a few minutes ago, but can you talk about what is a trigger and how someone might start to identify what theirs are?
Great question. So a trigger is anything that kind of sends us out of our comfort zone. It's any of those kind of makes our hair stand up on the back of our neck, right? We have this kind of reaction to it. Maybe we want to curl up inside. It's anything that starts to make us feel irritated, unsafe, emotionally activated. And that can be a variety of things, and it's going to be different for everyone. So it can be noises, it can be sounds, and it's usually something that reminds you of something negative or bad that's happened in your past.
And is there an easy way without feeling triggered for someone to identify those, or they just have to like keep track of when they what comes up for them?
Yeah, most of the time we start with identifying those things that you do have a reaction to. So when do you notice yourself kind of starting to want to like curl up or retreat inside? Or when do you notice yourself getting more tense? When do you notice kind of losing control of yourself? What was going on around you? And sometimes checking in with those five senses. What was there, a certain smell? Was there a certain sound that you heard that was just like irritating or dysregulating?
So you mentioned, that kind of coming into yourself, that wanting to curl up. Are there any other responses that a trigger might elicit?
Oh yeah, like losing control of our emotions. So sometimes I think about like anger, right? Where all of a sudden normally you're in control, kind of calm person, and then you have these infrequent moments where you snap and maybe you yell or lose your temper, or maybe you have this sudden urge of anxiety where you want to like run away or flee, or you feel frozen or stuck. Also, I think an important one too is sometimes with that people pleasing, that fawning, where we're just going to kind of go along with what's being said. All of those things are indicating that there's some trigger that's going on.
I'm really fascinated by the fawning response as well. I think that's been an interesting addition to the fight, flight, or freeze. When someone's in the moment and they're triggered, aside from maybe the tapping you mentioned earlier, what are some in the moment exercises people might turn to when they're feeling that activation?
Yeah, a lot of the times it's really to get yourself back centered. So one of my favorite ones actually comes from some DBT, but I use what we call the color technique a lot, where take a moment and you pick a color. So for example, my color is yellow. So if I feel that happen, I start to look for anything I can see in my surroundings that's yellow. So if I notice my heart racing, I notice myself feeling tense or anxious, my body's trying to say I need to feel safe. So that cues me. And then I start thinking of my color and I take in my surroundings and I start identifying anything I can see that is that color yellow, right? So it might be like a phone book, a picture on the wall, and I'm just looking for those things and seeing as many things as I can find with those colors. Another one that I like is any grounding. So like 3 things that you see in your vicinity, 3 things that you can hear. Is there a certain smell that you can notice? Anything that's going to help kind of get you back into the present moment.
In your book, you write about the calm place. Can you talk about more about what that is and how it helps somebody struggling with this?
Yeah, so in EMDR, we use what we call these resourcing skills, and they're essentially skills to help you get grounded and to help you start to feel safe again inside your body and when triggers occur. And Calm Place is one of those exercises. There's a bunch of different ways that you can do Calm Place, but ultimately the goal is we want to create kind of a place in your mind. It can be real, imagined, completely, made up. It could be someplace that you visited or that you want to go. And it just has to hold kind of this element of it feels calm or relaxing, or maybe even happy or peaceful. And you have the client visualize those. So you think about what this place would look like. You go through all the senses. What would the smells be, the sounds? And we use this as a way to kind of help someone get out of a trigger and to feel safe again in their body. And it also is helping teach them how to shift out of when they're triggered, how to control that and get back to a place where they feel more in control of themselves.
I feel like when I'm anxious, I like to picture the beach, like the sounds of the waves, the feeling of the sand, and it really helps.
To be a perfect example of calm place, right? And so we might
Exactly.
have you go there and think about that for a minute.
Yeah. Earning your continuing education hours doesn't have to be a painful experience. The right course can open your mind to new possibilities, increase your confidence, and hand you powerful tools to transform your clients' lives. Praxis Continuing Education and Training teams up with some of the brightest minds in mental health to provide cutting edge, evidence based training for practitioners. You can learn firsthand from experts like Stephen C. Hayes, Kelly Wilson, Robin Walzer, Kirk Strazel, and many others. Find your next training at praxiscet.com. That's praxiscet.com. In this work of, healing from trauma and PTSD, why is it so important for someone to understand these past experiences, even though they obviously can be painful to revisit?
Yeah, our past, not just from the past experiences, is not really what's important, what happened. It's the meaning that we gave those past experiences. And when you give something a meaning that changes the meaning about yourself, like I believe, like maybe I'm a bad person because the situation occurred in my past, that carries forward this belief that you're kind of this bad person. And so the goal isn't really with EMDR to go back and to relive any of those negative experiences. It's to help you find a new meaning of yourself. It's to help you break this negative meaning or maybe this lie you told yourself so that you can have more freedom in the future. And so it's important for us to go back and visit those so that you don't feel stuck or blunted, but that you can also live a more happy, productive life. And oftentimes we don't realize that a lot of those past experiences drive the meaning we give ourselves.
I really like that distinction because I think revisiting and reliving or, reprocessing all those memories can seem really daunting. But the way you put it with like changing the meaning, I think that makes it way less scary.
Yeah. And I mean, who wants to go back and relive negative things that happened? We don't want to do that, right? We've already endured it, but we want to go back and take and heal whatever we can from that. And that doesn't mean like placating it, but we want to just go back and take our power back from that and rediscover ourselves in despite of what's happened to us.
Exactly. And you kind of touched on it a little bit with the meaning behind those memories, but can you talk about what role negative core beliefs play into trauma and PTSD and how someone might identify theirs?
Yeah. So those negative beliefs are kind of like what we were just talking about, right? Like the meaning you give something, there's a meaning you give an experience, but there's also a meaning we give ourselves. There's a way that we internalize our role or our meaning in those experiences that we've had. And you can think about this like you give the meaning or the way you identify yourself in relationships. And so those form what we call these negative cognitions. And these negative cognitions are these negative beliefs that you carry around about yourself, the negative ways in which you've seen yourself and that have really maybe prevented you from doing some things that are, important to you or helping you become who you want to be. And so our goal with EMDR is we want to target those and help you break free from some of those negative beliefs you have. And so if you're going to identify those, start thinking about maybe those negative perceptions you have about yourself. What's some of the negative self-talk you have when you think about yourself? What are some of those negative aspects of yourself or maybe things you don't like about yourself? Those would be some of those negative core beliefs that maybe have come from somewhere based on some of your past experiences.
And now that we're, working through these negative core beliefs that have infiltrated us, what are some positive core beliefs that someone might start trying to identify with?
Yeah, the positive core beliefs are my favorite. This is what we work towards kind of finding. I'll give you, my personal example from my very first EMDR session that I ever did. And it's always stuck with me as I can do hard things or I'm worthwhile. I'm lovable, I have meaning. It's what you really want to desire to feel about yourself, what you wish you could feel from yourself. And if that's hard, sometimes it's identifying, how do I wish others could make me feel, or how do I wish others perceived me? Those are ultimately the beliefs that you really are trying to believe about yourself. And so those, you can find those that way.
I like the we can do hard things one.
Yeah,
That's really powerful. And I think it is applicable to almost anything in life, right?
absolutely.
What are some common coping strategies that people with trauma or PTSD tend to turn to? And what are some examples of ways people can replace these coping mechanisms with new skills?
Okay, so first question you're asking about, what are some ways like people tend to cope with trauma that
Yeah.
maybe isn't that healthy or productive?
Yes.
Yeah, so anytime we go through anything negative, we're going to find anything we can to prevent those negative experiences or those feelings from happening again. And depending on when you've experienced, whatever traumatic event that you faced, that can be a variety of different ways that maybe you've coped. But usually what we see with trauma that's been unresolved and some of those coping skills that we see people turn to is anytime someone's experienced trauma, I always want to know what their vice is. So what has been their vice or their go-to? So this could be like, these are any numbing behaviors or avoidant behaviors. So it could be like overworking. It could be overeating. It could be shopping addictions. It could be, bouncing from relationship to relationship. It could be in the form of addictions, like drinking or using drugs. It could also be with things like self-harm. And so anything that's like helping you numb or avoid or feel better in the moment are typically what people will go to.
What are some ways that people can start to replace those coping skills?
Yeah, identify them first, right? So it's like we have to be able to see what they are, and we have to have the willingness to kind of look at these and say, okay, this is an overindulgence, or really starting to assess, because sometimes it might be hard to know if something, am I using this as a coping skill in a negative way? And so maybe starting with, what am I hoping to feel out of engaging in this, right? Is it like escapism? Is it just to feel better because I can't tolerate those uncomfortable emotions? And so if you can start with identifying those, that's usually that first step. And then anytime we remove something, we have to replace it with something else. So what would be healthier to do? So maybe that's journaling, maybe it's working out, maybe it's learning to sit in the moments of those feelings for like a short period of time, like 5 to 10 minutes, and learning more of those coping skills in therapy, obviously, and some of those that we touch on in the book as well that you'll learn about.
Yeah, man, sitting with it is hard. The anxiety over the past 2 years, I was definitely like online shopping a lot. And I finally was just like, maybe you can add it to your cart, but maybe you don't impulse purchase it and you think about like why you actually want to buy it just to get something in the mail maybe. But yeah, it is hard to just be like uncomfortable.
Oh, it's so hard. And I like the little short increments of that. So I always start with clients saying, like, set a timer for like 5 minutes, let yourself be uncomfortable. And then after that 5 minutes, then you can go add things to your shopping cart online, but let yourself start practicing the discomfort a little bit more.
Yeah, exactly. That's good. 5 minutes is manageable, it seems like. So start small. At the root of all this, why is it important for people to start to trust and connect with themselves again?
Well, who doesn't want to ultimately want to have that connection with themselves, right? I think that's one of our basic core needs, is to feel love, and not just love of others, but to really love ourselves. But I mean, with anything, I think all of us seek that happiness and fulfillment, right? We all want that. We live in a culture where we're dying to like just feel good about ourselves, and ways that we can do that. And when you really can find that in a genuine way and really connect with yourself versus having other things that bring that sense or that feeling, you're going to see like other mental health issues decrease. So maybe depression and anxiety goes down, but you're going to find a more fulfilled life, a more connected life. healthier relationships with others.
That's all a really good promise.
Yeah.
One thing I really liked in your book was a section on restoration teams. I'm wondering if you could talk about what that is and how it can help offer new beliefs.
Yeah. I modified this a lot from Laura Parnell is one of my favorite attachment-based and EMDR clinicians. And she talks about this idea of building resources and having, these teams of supports that we can bring together. And I identify that as what I call this restoration team. It's this team of imaginal or creative or even real people that we can just bring to mind that can help us reconnect with our inner truth or who we, feel like we want to be or we're created to be. And so you do this in a variety of ways. You can identify anything or anyone as imaginal or as creative as you want to be that would represent different things like protection and nurturing and maybe even knowledge and spirituality or even your ideal self. And you identify anything that could be. So for example, that might be like, I have a client that uses like Dumbledore for wisdom. And so anytime I see her struggling or wrestling with this, like, I can't do this, this is too hard. I might say like, let's imagine kind of like going and having a meeting with Dumbledore. And what would Dumbledore tell you? Like, what would he remind you of? And so we kind of create like these imaginal people or things or objects that kind of represent these core traits that they're wanting to feel and experience to help them work past or work over some of these challenges that they're going through.
I like that it kind of takes them out of themselves and puts the responsibility elsewhere. And it's so easy for us to see other people with so much more compassion and all that stuff. So I like that, taking it out of yourself.
Yeah, it helps. Sometimes we need that, right? When we
Exactly.
can't find those answers in ourselves, like where can I go to be able to do that?
Yeah, I like that. And there's a large section of your book that talks about creativity. Can you talk about how creativity can help heal and maybe some like ideas for someone who's just starting to try to tap into that?
Yeah, and we just gave you a good example. One of the things I love about restoration team in general and any of the kind of resourcing techniques that we use in EMDR is that they can be so creative. And we know that those creative parts of the brain kind of fosters this sense of play, and it can really help your brain heal itself. It can help form new meanings and attachment connections to yourself and maybe even to others. And kind of like going back to what you said a few minutes ago, creativity is important too, because it also takes us out of ourself for a moment and those overwhelming feelings and allows us to tolerate things a little bit easier. And so I love creativity with this, whether it's like going back to calm place, like we talked about, drawing or having a picture of what calm place might be, or making kind of this board of our restoration team members that we can look at. And so any of those creative, like imaginal things that can help you really remember what you're trying to work towards can really help you with working through some of your trauma or PTSD.
Yeah, it seems like imagery is very important here. Like that's a big overarching theme of, everything we've talked about.
Yeah, imagery is important. I'll say it's not the only way that you can do EMDR. So everyone we all process and make sense of things in our own ways. So for some people that might be through imagery, others it might be through feelings in their body and movement. And so you can incorporate those things into EMDR and into your healing. It might also just be through thoughts, right? And maybe writing some of those down as you process. So there's a variety of different ways. The imagery is my favorite to play with just because I love the creative side of that aspect of this kind of work.
Yeah, I like that it can be customized to sort of how everybody's brain works. That's really nice. And now a big question. How can someone begin to find their purpose after their struggle with trauma or PTSD?
Yeah. Oh, it's a hard question. Finding our purpose, it can take some work. We can lose sight of that. Maybe we've never known what our purpose is. And one of the places that I would challenge you to kind of start for anyone that's trying to search for that purpose is I would say, tap into those things that you're passionate about. or that you used to be passionate about, those things that could capture your interest, that you could get maybe lost in for time being, no matter what they were, even if it feels like they're just a hobby. There's a reason you resonated with those things at some point in time, and it's somehow connected to your purpose. And your purpose is also about who have you always wanted to be, who have you always wish you could be or accomplish, or what you might do. You'll find your purpose kind of wrapped up in that as well.
Yeah, and I like that because I feel like so many of us find ourselves being defined by the things that have happened to us. And I feel like it's probably very easy to get lost in that and just keep going forward as if like you are the thing that happened to you.
Yeah. Oh, and I want to speak to that because that's some of the reason that I'm so passionate about doing this work. And for anyone listening, I would just tell you that you are so much more than anything that has ever happened to you, and that those things do not define you, but that can never steal. The one thing that trauma can never take away is who you were created to be and who you were meant to be. And so if you can find that and hold on to that, you will come back into contact with it again.
That's so powerful. And as we start to wrap up, I wanted to know, what advice would you give someone who's just sort of starting this journey to healing? Like, it's so hard to start. What would you say to them?
I would validate and tell you guys that it is hard, and it's okay that it's hard, and it's okay that it's going to take time, and there's times that it's going to suck and it's going to be painful and it's not going to go smooth, and it's okay. Feeling to healing is kind of what I say. You got to feel it to heal it. And so just go at your own pace. Don't rush through it. And remember that within your own work, there's no right or wrong way to do your work. The way that you heal and the way that you choose to grow and show up for yourself, it's right for you, regardless of what anyone else says. So just start with what feels tolerable and manageable to you and take it one step at a time.
I think that's a really good place to stop, Megan. Thank you so much for your expertise, your time, and this valuable conversation.
Yeah, I really appreciate you having me, and I appreciate all of the listeners that have tuned in, and I hope that there's been helpful things that you've been able to take away from this.
Do you struggle with the ongoing effects of trauma? If you've experienced a traumatic event or suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, you may believe that you're permanently damaged, that the anxiety, self-doubt, depression, and fear will never go away. The truth is that it's possible to rewire your brain so you can free yourself from the past, find healing, and live for the future. This workbook will show you how. In the EMDR Workbook for Trauma, you'll discover a complete program to help you get in touch with, understand, and heal from the beliefs, feelings, and bodily sensations connected to your trauma. You'll learn to work through past or current trauma using emotion regulation and grounding techniques, and identify the specific triggers, limiting self-beliefs, and symptoms standing in between you and lasting peace of mind. You'll also discover how to cultivate compassion for yourself when you're feeling stuck. Finally, you'll find tons of tips, tools, checklists, and worksheets to lead you step by step as you process, heal, and journey toward a life free from the effects of trauma. Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or EMDR, is proven effective, fast-acting treatment. Unlike the other approaches for treating trauma, EMDR not only treats the symptoms but helps you identify and resolve the underlying causes so you can safely process your traumatic memories. Using the EMDR techniques in this book, such as bilateral knee tapping and other variations of bilateral stimulation, you can actually train your brain to rewire itself and return to normal functioning despite negative past experiences. If you're ready to address your trauma with confidence, this workbook will gently lead you on the path to healing. Visit our website at www.newharbinger.com and use coupon code podcast25 to receive 25% off your entire order. New Harbinger Publications is an independent, employee-owned publisher of books on psychology, health, spirituality, and personal growth. For 50 years, our evidence-based self-help books and pioneering workbooks have helped readers make positive changes to improve mental health and well-being. Founded by psychologists Matthew McKay and Patrick Fanning, New Harbinger is proud to be an employee-owned company. Our books reflect our core values of integrity, sustainability, compassion, and trust. Written by leaders in the field and recommended by therapists worldwide, New Harbinger books are practical, accessible, and provide real tools for real change. Help your clients achieve lasting emotional balance with the DBT Skills Mega Bundle from New Harbinger Publications. This essential collection offers everything you need to effectively deliver dialectical behavior therapy in your practice. including a set of 8 exclusive microskills videos to help improve client motivation in treatment. Visit newharbinger.com for more information. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd love if you rated, reviewed, and subscribed to the show, and we hope you might share it with anyone who might benefit from the content. This podcast is not a substitute for counseling with a licensed provider.